This reflection will be based on the last 3 parts of chapter 4, beginning with the section entitled The Secularization of Suffering, pages 44 through 49. Job's so-called friends. It's an expression Monsignor uses a few times, the so-called friends of Job. He says they don't offer anything to Job in his sufferings because they act only as theologians of the past. And he doesn't mean that they're like old theologians from the past, but people who try to explain what God is doing or what God is about or what he's permitting only by looking to the past. But we know that Monsignor believes that while pain originates from something that happened in the past, suffering points to the future. So doctors can help with pain by identifying causes, but suffering requires a different response, because suffering is a cry that reaches beyond, reaches out. So the secularization of suffering tries to treat suffering as if it were only pain, to try to heal spiritual agony through the application of the physical sciences, denying the existence of the transcendent for which the suffering person is reaching, denying that there is anything or anyone to reach for, to cry out for. Monsignor calls this the empty theology of Job's, quote, comforters, and he said it's rejected even by God himself. And he likens it to that time when Jesus healed the man born blind. Remember, Christ's disciples asked him about that man, who sinned, this man or his parents? So they're concerned only with causality. But Jesus rebukes them, and he says, it's so that God's glory may be manifest in him. He directs their hearts to what he's about to do, to the near future. The invitation Monsignor is making to us is to resist the temptation to offer easy explanations for suffering, whether psychological, physiological, or even spiritual, and to cry out to God, to push forward, even to struggle against God if we have to, as Heidegger says, that through the suffering, God's glory may be manifest in the person who is suffering. So a true friend is one who is willing to co-suffer, instead of trying to fit everything into his or her previously formed theological system of thought. And this is why Monsignor calls Job's friends so-called friends. They don't really suffer with Job. They're not really with him. They stand apart from him, hoping to stumble upon some cause for his suffering and then point it out to him. But the true friend would enter into Job's suffering with him, not to pretend to feel his pain, but to suffer with him in the asking of questions, to seek with him, to cry from the heart with him. And this is where Monsignor transitions into that word on grace, which is the love of God, because the friend is the one who permits grace, right? Gets out of the way of God, permits grace to transcend like neat, already constructed little theological systems of thought. Grace breaks in like the mud that Jesus put on the eyes of the man born blind, like totally unexpected. Monsignor Albacete has the funniest way of retelling that gospel passage about the man born blind. He says something like, imagine you're sitting quietly outside of the temple, minding your own business, and then all of a sudden this guy comes along and throws mud in your eyes. You would be like, what the heck, this is worse than kids. And then that guy tells you to go wash in the pool, and you'd say, no, I'm just going to sit here all day with mud in my face. Like, what the heck? He wasn't expecting it, this man. He'd been suffering, crying from the heart. He wasn't expecting the healing. It didn't fit neatly into any system of thought with which he was familiar, and in that sense, it was an illustration of the working of God's grace. And that grace of God, Monsignor says, bestows identity, because it is the inbreaking of, ready, that original love that created us, that formed us in the womb when we were given our identity. So it's interesting that after the man born blind receives his sight, the Pharisees call his parents in to question them. But John, as he's writing his gospel, tells us that they said he can answer for himself. It's interesting. It was almost as if they understood that the love that their son met in Christ was a love even greater than their own natural love. Their son was met with what Monsignor calls a sudden experience of that original love that created us, formed us from the dust of the ground by breathing his life into it, like a man making mud with his spittle. So if God's grace is an encounter with that original love that created us, that means it alone can speak to the heart of the sufferer, the heart of the one who is crying in the experience of suffering. This is why God turns Job's mind not to answers, because that's not really what Job is looking for. Instead, he turns Job to his identity. He invites him to consider who he is. God even joins in the asking, or as Monsignor says, God co-suffers with Job, praying with Job. But let's stay here for a second. God turns Job to his identity. Why? Because at the core of our identity is that original love that created us, which is the love of God. And if by love of God we mean his suffering love for us, then our sufferings are also happening in his heart. This is where we read on page 47 that most striking line of Monsignor's, which is incidentally used to conclude the video trailer for Cry of the Heart, namely, it is there that we are going to penetrate and find the response inside God himself. Our sufferings pierce his heart. This means that at the end of all of our sufferings is an opening, a doorway that opens into God's own heart. So if we follow our suffering, that cry, that longing for the transcendent, we can enter into God, but only if we follow the suffering where it leads. We'll be tempted, I think, to ignore the questions provoked by suffering and to focus solely on the pain and its causes, but it is the suffering which Monsignor says John Paul II understood to be an exclusively human phenomenon that can lead man beyond himself, because it is only the human person who questions in the experience of pain. Anyway, not to settle for the past, as Monsignor writes, as if it were just pain and a problem to be solved, or even for the present, but to press on in the experience of suffering to where it leads. Now, there's a little more to be looked at in these sections, but I think we've done enough for now, and I want to mention one more thing that Monsignor wrote here. It's what he quotes at the top of page 47. I wonder if it struck you too. He's quoting that French novelist Georges Bernanos again. Speaking of the mother who is mourning the loss of her child, moaning of an exhausted resignation, Bernanos writes that God can only sweetly whisper in her ear, "One day you will know, you will understand, you will thank me. But now, what I await from you is your pardon. Forgive me." And imagine God saying, "I beg your pardon, forgive me." I remember Monsignor saying something similar in an interview, that we need to forgive God, and it shocked the host. But you can hear what Bernanos means, and why Albacete would be sympathetic toward this way of saying it. It's by the path of suffering, not of pain alone, but of suffering, the way of the cross, that we pierce the heart of God. But is there really no other way? It's the question that Christ asked in the garden. Is there no other way to enter into glory? He asked the question in solidarity with all of us, with the world of suffering, as Monsignor calls it. But you can imagine the Father's reply, "What I await from you is your pardon. Forgive me," or "I'm sorry." Sorrow in the heart of God, which means because we suffer and he loves us, he allows that love to pierce his own heart, which transforms his suffering into sorrow. And yeah, in that sense, you can imagine God saying, "I'm sorry." It's amazing. We'll continue our reading with the beginning of chapter 5, The Mystery of the Cross, in the next reflection, looking at pages 50 to 53 of Albacete's Cry of the Heart.